All right. Welcome back, everybody. I gave you an extra minute. So I think we're all set for John here for the planning board roles and responsibilities. Thank you, John, for joining us. I think you were around for most of Attorney Christine Johnston's presentation. If you have a little bit of time at the end, maybe you can address a couple of those questions. You were already in the chat, providing a few answers. I think Christine ended up actually answering a few questions that had come up throughout the presentation. Sorry we couldn't get to more of them, but like I said, there is the very end of the day, we've got a full Q&A session, and we'll ask any questions that don't get answered during the sessions during that time as well, and that will be recorded. So if you can only really join us for the first part of the day, you can always log back on and check out that session later on, and we'll make sure we get to your question. All right, well, with that out of the way, John, if you want to take control and uh, it's all there you go. Perfect.
I think I've got it.
Take it away.
Thank you, Brendan, and thank you everyone else for being here. So I'm here to talk to you this morning about planning board roles and responsibilities, and you'll probably hear some overlap with Christine's presentation a few minutes ago, and some further elaboration on certain topics as well. A little bit about myself. So I'm John Christ. I'm with UNH Cooperative Extension, and I work with their community and economic development team as a field specialist in Merrimack County. And with that, I will turn to our next slide and tell you a little bit about what we'll be talking about here today. So I'm going to start by just talking broadly about some of our civic responsibilities as members of the planning board, and from there turn to look at some of our land use law and resources. So where do we go when we need to learn more, because these presentations today can be pretty dense sometimes, and you need to go and find out more information. Where do you look? And then finally, looking at those three realms of the planning board: planning, legislative, and regulatory, that we've already heard a little bit about in our last session. So begin civic responsibilities. So we heard a little bit already about what the role of the planning board is, and we really do play a very important role in our communities, in the civic life and kind of protecting the general welfare of our communities. And it's our role to provide for the orderly growth and development of our communities, and for our zoning, to provide for and promote the health, safety, and general welfare of our communities. I think it is helpful here to do a little bit of a kind of look backward, in part as we mark the 100th anniversary of the Euclid decision, which I'll say more about in a moment, but just to kind of get a perspective on planning and zoning in history, at least a short one. The practice of planning, shaping our collective spaces, goes back a very, very long time in history, of course. And as we get closer to our present day, it starts to become more professionalized and starts to take on the shape that we expect to find today in our world here in the United States and beyond. So it's difficult to really pinpoint where planning begins. Zoning, we could be a little bit more specific about. We start to see land use laws starting to appear in their modern forms in the 19th century, and we start to see laws starting to take place about dimensional requirements, about the separation of uses by land or zones or districts. And this was often done, of course, to provide for safety, right? Separating off residential uses from heavy industrial uses, to make sure we are providing for that general welfare of the community. And in terms of dimensional requirements and such, we often look back to the 1916 New York City zoning ordinance as one of our major points of benchmark points in the development of land use regulations and zoning. And in 1926, there was the very well-known decision of Euclid versus Amber Realty, which was handed down by the Supreme Court of the United States, which said that regulating uses by zones, by districts, is a valid and legal exercise of power. Um, and this is the basis of what we call Euclidean zoning today after the town of Euclid. And why even think about this as we think about our role on the planning board. It's important to know, as Christine was talking about with some of the enabling legislation in New Hampshire, but also thinking more broadly nationally about where this right to do this work comes from. And anybody who's been on a board for a while has probably heard that such and such about what you're doing on this board. Zoning itself even might be described by somebody as a taking or such. And it's important to know that this sort of work that we do is ensconced in state law and as well as in Supreme Court decisions going back at this point 100 years. So it is important to know about this. And I should say, for disclosure, in addition to working with UNH Cooperative Extension, I also have been serving on a local planning board in my own community for several years now, which also informs some of what we'll be talking about here today. So to get a little bit further into our civic responsibilities, um, those of us who serve on boards serve as volunteers for a municipality, help to represent our communities, and we hopefully take our role seriously, and we've probably made that decision to put a lot of time and effort of our lives into this role because either we enjoy it or we really think it's an important service for our community. Um, and kind of skip order here a little bit. One of the most fundamental things we do, of course, is make decisions about development and land use in our communities. But what we also do is we maintain and build, hopefully, maintain and build trust in municipal governance through this role. And when we lead meetings and deliberations with openness and transparency, as Christine described in our last session, we really are building that trust in the work that we do and building a more productive environment for all sorts of things within our communities by doing so. And you'll be happy to have that trust when a really difficult decision does come before the board, that people understand that you are approaching things transparently with openness, and that although it's a difficult, contentious decision, that they can trust in you and in the process that you represent. Another thing we do is we provide opportunities for public engagement. That can be through public hearings, but also through the master planning process, as we'll talk about in a little bit, through more sustained public engagement as well. Because, a big part of what we do is we communicate effectively and we listen. So by communicating effectively, performing outreach, we're informing the town of what's going on with our planning efforts, of what's going on with applications that we're hearing, and we're making sure that they are kept abreast. And it's really important. It's a really important part of our role to listen to developers, but also to listen to the public and what the public has to say. And there are statutory places where this is mandated, and there are places where we can go above and beyond, and we'll talk about that a bit later. And the importance of sometimes really doing a thorough job of listening so the community feels like they have ownership over the process and that they have a voice in municipal governance. The alternative is that people feel the process is opaque and that maybe it's unfair and that that communication starts to break down. So coming up, I have a little bit of a checklist here that kind of repeats and takes a kind of a little bit of a new tack on some of these materials. So the first couple of check marks here really have to deal with, as a planning board member, do your homework, be prepared. Part of that is familiarizing yourself with your local ordinances and procedures, your zoning ordinance, your master plan, and site plan review regs, and so on and so forth. Be familiar with these documents, your own rules of procedure for your board, state laws. Obviously, there's a lot of this information. You're not expected to memorize it all, but be familiar with it, know where to look for more information. And then prepare for your meetings. Don't come into the meeting expecting to be able to just kind of read through an application and be ready to go. Read the application ahead of time and do the necessary preparation to make a fair and informed decision. Be respectful of fellow board members and the public. Treat everyone that comes before you with respect. If they're not treating you with respect, try to still return the gesture of treating them with respect. And again, that goes a long way to build trust. And even if we don't feel like we want to respect someone, in our heads, which I know happens sometimes to board members, still maintain that level of respect in what you do. The next three bullets can kind of be lumped together in some ways about hearing applications fairly without bias. And we heard more about this from Christine as well. Do not prejudge applications. As we also heard about, do not talk about them outside of board meetings, especially on social media. But even in general conversations, if you're in the midst of a continued public hearing or something, or coming up to a public hearing, don't start talking about potential applications, especially judging those applications outside of a board meeting, and expressing opinions about them. And all of that can kind of get wrapped into understanding our right to know laws, RSA 91A, which are really important. If you have conversations about board matters and board decision making outside of a board meeting, with one person, you're okay. But if it starts to become a quorum, I say one person, you're okay, depending on what you say and how, depends. But once you start to involve more people and you involve a quorum, and not even at one time, even sequentially, you're in violation of the law. And you're breaking people's public trust in the open process, but also you're breaking the law at that point. And so be careful of that. Recuse yourself when appropriate. And we heard quite a bit from Christine about that and the juror standard, and about the fact that, even if you take a vote as a board on whether someone should recuse, it is non-binding, but it is your responsibility to understand your obligations to the board, including to step down from a particular decision and from deliberations, and recuse yourself from a case. And again, as opposed to just abstaining from the vote itself, recuse yourself from the entire case if necessary. So I have a little bit about the mechanics of the board here for members and meetings and so forth. And why is this under kind of civics? It could have this kind of fallen into a general mechanics category, but maintaining these proper mechanics and the predictability of meetings and how they function is also part of that civic function of making sure that things are going by the law, but also in a predictable way that people can follow and not being taken off guard. So about membership, by the numbers, it varies from municipality to municipality, but in a city, there should be a 9-member board. In cities or towns, in towns, you will either have a 5 or 7-member board as decided by the town. In town councils, which are less common, you may have, I believe, 7 or 9 members, I believe it is, on a council, town council, that is. Membership, there are 2 basic forms of membership for a board. One is to be appointed by the governing body, your city council, town council, select board, or to be directly elected. Alternates, up to 5 can be authorized, and they may participate as non-voting members in New Hampshire, and they may also be designated as voting members if a full member is absent or disqualified. And make sure to clarify what your particular municipality allows and how that all plays out within your own rules of order. Every board has an ex officio member, typically a select board member or council member. You may also have a city manager or mayor in city boards. that serve on the board, and their alternates are not exchangeable with other alternates in the board. And so just keep that in mind as well. And of course, as a board, once a year, you get to determine who your officers are, your chair, and any other officers you may have in your board. And so you get to decide that once a year. And it's important to note, right, the chair sets the agenda and the chair gets to facilitate the meetings as well. All comments and discussions should be going through the chair. And it really is the chair who sets the agenda. They often do this in consultation with the town staff, the planner, land use administrator. But really, they should be kind of serving an advisory role, kind of filling in details, maybe doing a lot of the back work and paperwork. But really, the ultimate decisions in setting that agenda and then facilitating the meeting that grows out of that really should fall to the chair. So, planning board meetings. Planning boards are mandated to have at least one meeting per month, even if they don't have any applications or perceive themselves to have other business to do. They do need to have at least one meeting per month. Many boards have in their own regulations and bylaws that they might have two meetings per month typically. And it's a good opportunity to kind of think about your own board, how it wants to, delegate how it deals with the different elements of its role in the community, its planning roles, its more legislative roles, its more regulatory roles, and how you might, divide that work up between your at least one meeting a month, maybe two meetings a month or so, and or maybe even occasionally special meetings that you might have for particular needs having to do with master plans and such. A quorum for a meeting is the majority of the membership of the board. And if people plan on attending virtually to your meeting, they may do so if it's not reasonably practical for them to attend otherwise. So they may attend virtually, but do remember that the quorum must be composed of physically present members in order to conduct business. So anybody who is attending virtually is above and beyond your physically present quorum. And it's good to think about as well, thinking about membership on the board, how to maintain that level for a quorum. Think about how do you retain your members? By holding good, productive meetings, by having a collegial atmosphere on the board so board members don't cycle on and off too quickly. But then also, how do you keep like other members coming in as alternates and maybe becoming full members? And thinking about what recruiting looks like. Ideally, people want to be on the board and they'll be banging down your doors to join the board, but in reality, that doesn't always happen. So it's sometimes encouraged, if you see an active community member, maybe encourage them to get more involved, maybe become an alternate, and keep people engaged and keep people as alternates. So you have people learning the ropes who can become full members as other members circulate off for whatever reason it may be. So being heard and promoting civility and trust, this is important. I've already addressed this. And there are ways of putting into your bylaws, your codes of conduct, how you might do some of that. So it can include the basic mechanics. These bylaws and such can include the basic mechanics of your meetings, but it can also include a bit more about above and beyond that, about how to maintain order. So your board meetings look like the two people above on the right there kind of dancing happily with one another rather than on the bottom right arguing with one another. So, you can include rules about, what it means to listen to people, not interrupt one another. Obviously, your chair should be facilitating that, but to have a little bit of that kind of filled in the back as well in your code of conduct can be helpful. Beyond that, looking outside for, pointers, you can look to Robert's Rules of Order. Not all of that overlays perfectly onto planning boards, but it's still a lot of good stuff to find there. And really helpful are Reagan's rules. Not everybody has always read Reagan's rules, but in many cases, they can be really helpful for planning boards and thinking about how to run a productive, positive meeting. And if you don't know where to look for Riggins rules, if you do a quick search online, you should be able to find them. And I believe the New Hampshire Municipal Association website also hosts a page devoted to Riggins rules. Let's see. I'll be fairly quick about finances, but do be aware that the planning board does have the authority to get involved in funding matters for its own business. And this is covered, as you see at the bottom there, in RSA 673-16. And so this allows the board to employ people, to do engineering work, to work as consultants, to it allows the board to get grant money to work on projects like the HOP program that many communities have been involved in recently for housing, or to do a master plan study to hire a consultant. All that can be handled by the board. Fees collected, kept in separate non-lapsing accounts, not commingled with other funds. And it's important to know, hopefully in most of our cases, our town staff can help out with this, and it's not directly falling on the board to manage this part of our obligations. All right. So up next, land use law and resources. Um, as I was saying at the outset, there's a lot to know about land use law and resources, or about land use law, and there are lots of resources to help us with this. We are not expected to memorize everything. Some of us know more than others, but nobody really can memorize all the nuances of all the laws out there. So it's good to know how to find that information when you do need it. Um, So there's lots of land use law documents that we can look at, and we'll see a bit more of them on the next slide. We also have our municipal land planning documents and land use documents, like our zoning ordinance and our site plan review regulations and all that, that we should get to know and at least know where to find when we need to refer back to them for a more nuanced look. We have lots of state level planning and land use resources. New Hampshire OPD, of course, is probably top among them. The Municipal Association as well has lots of really great resources. New Hampshire Housing, if you're interested in kind of housing development and housing planning, has lots of great resources. Handbooks like the Planning Board handbook you see on the right there is really helpful, has tons of information that you can refer back to. Various toolkits for various forms of land use, calculators like the housing calculator that OPD hosts on this website. Videos and slide decks like from today and other events are available. Lots of resources are available, as well as just staff to talk to. Your regional planning commissions are also really helpful. For smaller lifts, they can often just kind of step in and provide some guidance. For bigger lifts, they can often also do things like circuit riding to replace a temporarily absent planner or other things, and are just a great resource for thinking about all sorts of things you might get involved in, including master planning in many cases. Um, I think an underutilized resource for many people is their municipal staff. Your local land use staff, your town planner, land use administrator are really an invaluable resource, and in many cases can be your first kind of go-to point for navigating the world of planning, pointing you in the right directions for finding more information, or just kind of giving you that information themselves. I really can't stress how important it is, if you have this staff in your community, to make use of them as necessary. And then finally, of course, a municipal attorney. When the board is in doubt about the law, seek counsel. Um, don't overuse it, but really, if you are in doubt, seek counsel. It's much better to seek counsel ahead of time rather than after you get yourself in trouble. Um, So here are some more resources and links to those resources for all the RSAs. You can go to the website, all these laws we're referring to, or to the book on the right. This is the current year's book there. I believe that's the current year from LexisNexis. You can also seek out information on current bills and legislation that's being considered, past court cases. New Hampshire Municipal Association has lots of information on their website, so check all of this out for more information. And these slides, of course, will be available, including those links. And I think Brendan has been putting some of these links in the chat as well. So now on to the three realms of the planning board, beginning with the planning role. So the planning role, as you've already heard a bit from Christine this morning, is really kind of central to so much of what we do. And although it does not have any regulatory power, like the master plan, for example, it really provides the foundation for so much of what we do and the legal basis for creating the regulatory documents that build off of that, including our zoning ordinance. So the master plan, described in RSA 674, 1 through 4, describes your vision, your wish list, your goals for your community, and your current and projected land use in your community, with lots of research going into this, into land use, but also into what your community wants and feels about its community, how it understands its community and its character, and so on and so forth. A lot of this ends up in the master plan. So yeah, there are two required chapters, the vision and land use chapter, and then lots of potential optional chapters, much of which are outlined in these RSAs that we see at the top there. The implementation is one of those optional chapters, and many master plans include this to give a little bit more concrete of a roadmap as to how to achieve the vision and land use goals that are outlined in the master plan. So that implementation section can be really helpful, as well as housing, transportation, economic development, natural resources, recreation, and others. And you can look for the full list in the RSAs. It is recommended to revise your master plan every 5 to 10 years. Typically, we think about 10 years as a kind of best practice sort of ballpark. Although, you can also judge that if on what you're seeing in your community, if you're feeling that your master plan is out of date to where you are today, it's probably time to consider a new master plan. Maybe making some new goals, reassessing your current land use and what your projected land use will be. But 10 years is kind of ballpark considered in many cases best practice. And why emphasize this? Because I think many planning boards know this, but in practice, sometimes it doesn't always quite happen in 10 years. But do try to keep up with that. The master plan is adopted by the planning board. It is not a regulatory document. It really has no power to regulate land use in your town, although it should guide your development of your land use regulations. But as a non-regulatory document, it can be adopted by the planning board itself. It shall involve, per the RSAs, not should, but shall involve solicitation of public comments. And ideally, you should do some more extensive public engagement than just a couple of statutory public hearings to really find out what the community wants and let this be a community vision for the community rather than one dictated by the planning board. And this gives people ownership over their community and a real sense that they're involved in the planning process. And on the right, you see some pictures of what visioning sessions and such can look like for a community. Depending on the size of your community, it might not be quite as full of people, but these are the sorts of things we might do for public engagement and soliciting public comments for a master planning process. Yeah, so it is strictly advisory. It does not have regulatory weight, but it does inform so much of what else you do. So when you're creating a zoning ordinance, you need to have a master plan to have the ability to create a zoning ordinance. And ideally, a zoning ordinance should reflect what's in your master plan. And as your master plan gets updated, so can your zoning ordinance to reflect those changing desires and changing plans. And on the flip side of that, when you're trying to make zoning changes, it's really helpful to be able to point back to the public engagement you did as part of your master plan to say, like, hey, the community wants these changes. It's not just us on the board saying we want these changes, but you can really point back to the master plan and the community engagement in the master plan and the research that went into the master plan to say, like, these zoning amendments that we're suggesting really come out of this really extensive process. Of course, you'll have to make zoning amendments sometimes that are not fully justified, perhaps in the master plan, and sometimes it's just because state law changes and you need to keep up with that. But ideally, these two documents will get tied in pretty closely to one another. um, okay. I see I'm a few minutes behind where I was hoping to be on my timeline, so I will try not to run over like we did previously. And I think the good news is here that it is hard to kind of keep oneself from explaining all the little nuances sometimes. And the good news is here, I think Christine has gone over some of this before, so I don't have to go over it in too much depth. But it's important to note that some of our more regulatory functions, like impact fees and stuff, grow out of having our master plan. So that includes our zoning regulations. It includes having a capital improvements program, which we heard about in our last presentation, to guide our long-term public expenditures in our community. And if we have a capital improvements program, we can also have an impact fee ordinance. And we can also think about, which are less common, but growth management ordinances as well. If we need to slow things down a little bit, that also is aided by having these other documents that allow this to take place. So I'll move forward through these pretty quickly then. Yeah, and Christine talked about the proportionality of impact and the rational nexus, for example, for impact fees, all of which are really important to keep in mind. So the three realms of the planning board, the legislative role is coming up next. This is where we devise our zoning ordinance and our site plan and subdivision regulations and other ordinances as well that we might want to pass as a community. This is where the board can seem a little bit more political at times, and that neutrality that we expect in applications is not fully in place. We should still, though, we shouldn't have this appear to be just, subject of our personal whims or personal political biases. When we're engaging in that legislative role, we really should be looking back to our master plan, to other things we do to justify the changes that we're making as being a benefit to the community, and not just to our personal interests. That really is where the legislative role comes from, our public role as servants to the public and the public's interests in the community, and those more generalized public interests we have within that community. So these are where the zoning ordinances, where those kind of goals we have in our master plan can become more legally binding to regulate and restrict development as we see fit for our community, and to encourage certain types of development over other types of development that are beneficial for our community. Regulating the location, use, density, dimension, size, and such of our developments within our community. Because of its regulatory functions and legally binding regulatory functions, these are adopted by the local legislative body, whether that be the city council or your town meeting. Zoning amendments, changes to your zoning ordinance are typically recommended by the planning board. They can be recommended by a council or by a citizen petitioned amendment or proposed amendment to your zoning ordinance with 25 registered voters certified by your town clerk typically, saying that we want to change our zoning ordinance in such and such a way. They too can put forth a amendment, and whatever amendments come forward, the planning board must hold a public hearing and hear from the public. And if it's the planning board's own amendments or proposed amendments, as is typically the case, the planning board may also change some of the wording of its amendments um, following a public hearing. If it determines that it wants to change some of its language following a public hearing, if those are merely administrative changes about wording of something that doesn't really change the substance of the proposed amendment, then that can still go forth. If you're choosing to change something more substantive about the amendment, then that proposed amendment must go to a second public hearing before it gets officially voted upon, up or down. New Hampshire OPD has a really great zoning amendment calendar that you can consult, telling you about all the relevant deadlines for filing and public hearings and final language to be submitted to the clerk and so on and so forth. And so that's really a helpful thing to consult, and they come out with this every year to help us through this process. As part of its more legislative functions, making decisions about our regulations that impact the broader community and how we regulate things within our community. The planning board also has the power to develop subdivision regulations and site plan regulations. For site plan regulations, it also needs to have adopted a zoning ordinance. And this is all spelled out in RSA 674, 35 to 42 for subdivision and 43 to 44 for site plan regulations. Our subdivision regulations are supposed to provide against such scattered or premature subdivision and provide for the harmonious development of the municipality, and how by identifying standards for property boundaries, lot configurations, road construction standards, and more. And there's a lot to do with road construction standards when you're subdividing and providing access to your new subdivided process parcels, especially for major subdivisions. And let's see, plans for the development, site plan regulations are planned for the development or change or expansion of use of tracts for residential uses or for multifamily dwelling units. So this is for mostly non-residential uses or multifamily residential, as we heard in our previous presentation. And this can regulate a lot of aspects of that development: parking, landscaping, environmental impacts, signage rules, and so on and so forth. These regulations as well, both subdivision and site plan regulations, can be adopted by the planning board with a public hearing. The adoption does require a full majority of the board. In other words, if you have a 7-person board, it does require 4 people to vote in favor of adopting those regulations, regardless of what your quorum that is this evening. So if only 4 of your 7 people showed up to make a quorum, all 4 of them must vote to adopt site plan or subdivision regulations, which is different than other votes, for example, in applications that your board may take. It's really important to make these regulations as clear as possible. And this is for various reasons. It minimizes the need for too many subjective judgments when applications come forward, where you can really point to your regulations in determining your judgments. And it also helps the board and the applicant really understand what the expectations are. If the standards are overly vague, not only do you not have a lot of guidance on what you're applying to the application, but the applicant also is wondering, like, huh, I wonder what this town really wants. Like, they haven't been very specific here. And an applicant may not, appreciate you being overly specific and overly demanding on them. But they do often appreciate some concrete level of guidance, some specific level of guidance on what your expectations are for your plans. Um, yeah, and if you want to regulate something, don't just try to throw it into your zoning ordinance, to your site plan and subdivision regulations. If it rises to the level of zoning, put it in your zoning ordinance. This is where it belongs. Just important to keep that in mind. And finally, we get to the regulatory role, and this is where we really start hearing applications and having to enact, or not enact, but use those regulations in more practical conditions with specific applications and not just in consideration of the general welfare of our communities. And this is where it becomes really key for us to be as impartial in our decision-making process as possible. And this includes a lot of things. Um, Obviously, we can't make statements that appear biased, that we're prejudging an application. But it's really important as a board to appear objective, to even consider things like, your body language and such, where you might say one thing and indicate something else with your body language or an eye roll or something like that. Try to be careful of that. It's not as important, your body language and that sort of thing, as what you say, but do try in every way you can to maintain that level of impartiality in reviewing applications. Um, so site plan and subdivision regulations and review processes really are the most common of the procedures that we're looking at here. But there are other regulatory roles you can also serve as a planning board. And so looking at this, we heard a bit about this process from our previous presentation already. So we can see the timeline there on our right, roughly elaborated, as we'll see in future slides from here on out. You can do a preliminary consultation, really with no set time limit. Once an application is submitted, certain clocks start ticking, although not the big 65-day clock that we heard about, we'll talk about in a moment. But the 21 days prior to anticipated submittal to have a first meeting for anticipated acceptance of that application. You can shorten that if you want on your judgment as a board, but you can't require more than 21 days. Notice to abutters that there will be a public hearing and a public meeting on acceptance, and potentially that there will also be a public hearing, needs to be made at least 10 days prior to acceptance and 10 days prior to the public hearing. And you can do both of these in the same public notice to abutters and to the public. But you can also do them separately if you choose to do them separately. So yeah, it's a public notice about the application and the fact that the board is going to hear this application and potentially accept it, and a public notice following the RSAs to where those notices need to be placed for the eventual public hearing as well. Any abutters also need to be noticed in writing prior to the meeting, and that's up to the applicant to provide funds for noticing abutters and to provide the list of abutters. And for what constitutes an abutter, you can consult the RSAs. Hopefully, in this process, you will have staff in your community that can help you through a lot of this pretty difficult work at times to kind of work through all this. And a lot of this work, if you do have town staff, planner, land use administrator, they will be working to kind of see through this process. Ultimately, after acceptance of the application, you do need to make a decision of some sort within 65 days, with certain exceptions. Those exceptions can be determining that it's a regional impact, that you've both agreed to extend it beyond 65 days mutually, or there are a few other, at least one other exception as well that can be made sometimes. Those are the two most common. And then finally, when you make your decision at the end of this process, you need to issue a written decision to the applicant within 5 business days. Seeing if I missed anything in my notes here. Okay. So pre-application review is not mandatory, certainly by state regulations, although you may make it mandatory in your municipality to go through some kind of pre-application review process. It's often a good suggested practice, especially for more complex applications to go through this process. So you can do a conceptual consultation, non-binding, there's no public hearing, and because it's a fairly broad level conversation, you don't need to notify abutters as well about a preliminary conceptual consultation. It's easy to kind of napkin sketch concepts, and you're really trying to have a general conversation about expectations and processes and so forth in that kind of consultation. If it starts getting very specific and you start to look at what look like site plans, you might not be in a conceptual consultation anymore. You might be in a design review. And design review does have a little bit higher of a bar. These are more specific conversations. They start to look a little bit more like site plans. More specific recommendations can be offered by the planning board. And because it's starting to get more specific, notice does need to be published of the design review taking place at your meeting. A design review also gives you vesting from zoning changes for up to 12 months after the end of design review process. So do keep that in mind as well. So once someone goes through the design review at a noticed meeting, they do have some vesting if they put an application in against zoning changes for 12 months. Okay. So then we get to the formal application, and so the application is received by the town. Following that, abutters are notified, as we just mentioned a moment ago. A decision is made often by staff, if you have staff working with you, on if there's need for departmental review of any sort. So that can all be collected before it even goes to a meeting, although a meeting can also be a place to determine if further departmental review is needed. You can also put in your regulations themselves if certain applications or all applications, certain scope of development requires departmental review or even review by third-party consultants. So this might be something that's already determined by the writing of your regulations. If it's not, though, this can also be determined by the board once it sees the application and starts considering whether it's a complete application for acceptance. And if you're going to do a third-party review, this is something ideally that happens as early as possible in the process. So that might be because it's in your regulations, or at the very least, try to do it before acceptance even, determine if that's necessary. Because once you're accepted, then your clock starts ticking. You can still ask for it after acceptance. But again, the earlier, the better. Um, and let's see. So this is all prior to acceptance. You look at waivers. If waivers are being requested by your applicant, so you look at your application as a board. You consider whether all your checklist items and anything else required is there. And if it's not there, you determine if there are any waivers. You look at those waivers in writing and determine, and a waiver request process and whether it's in writing should be in your regulations. And you look at whether the waivers seem reasonable. And there are, my notes here, there are ways of determining whether waivers are reasonable and whether they should be granted by a vote of the board. And it shouldn't just be like just because I want to give a waiver here, just because your feels here that you want to give a waiver. There should be some kind of specific reason that this requirement is not needed for this application. It's a hardship based upon the goals of your ordinance, of your regulations, that this is an unnecessary hoop to go through for this particular application. So as per the RSAs, a waiver can be granted if strict conformity would pose an unnecessary hardship to the applicant, and the waiver would not be contrary to the spirit and intent of the regulation, or specific circumstances relative to the subdivision, or conditions of the land in subdivision, or alternatively in the site plan review, indicate that the waiver will properly carry out the spirit and intent of the regulations. And this is why you should give waivers, not just because somebody asks and you feel like you want to be nice to this person. You should consider if it's a regional impact, and there are certain determinants of regional impact, relative size or number of dwelling units as compared with existing stock that might impact a broader region in terms of traffic and other things, proximity to borders of a neighboring community, transportation networks, anticipated emissions of light, noise, smoke, odors that might have a regional impact, shared facilities such as schools and solid waste disposal that might also make this into a regional impact. In many cases, it'll be pretty clear that something is not a regional impact, but when it becomes clear that something might be a regional impact, do have a vote on whether it is a regional impact. And if you vote that it is a regional impact or is probably a regional impact, it is time to pause your review process, contact your regional planning commission, and contact any relevant abutting towns. And this is going to give you a 30-day extended timeline for the application. And once this has all happened, you can accept the application as complete, assuming it has met your requirements. So once it's accepted as complete, your clock has started ticking with the 65 days. Again, with certain caveats to that 65 days. And it's time to, start to gather evidence. Some of that evidence might be outside of your public hearing, like the submitted application. You might also have some guidance from a staff report that might include departmental review and such. And you open a public hearing, which is statutorily required, and you let people speak. The applicant, abutters, anyone with a direct interest in the application, which there's some level of leeway there in what is, a direct interest in the application. Anybody with easements and other similar that you have similar legal obligations to have to be allowed to speak. And beyond that, it's really who are permitted by the board to testify is who is allowed to speak here. Typically, residents are allowed to speak at most planning board meetings on applications, but there is a little bit of discretion there. And you do have discretion as well, whether you allow non-town residents to speak. But certainly applicant, abutters, easement holders, anyone with any kind of direct interest is mandated to be given the right to speak at a public hearing. And because direct interest can be kind of broadly determined, really it's often best practice to let residents and anybody who determines themselves to have an interest in this to speak. And that can be in person. It can be also through a letter to the board and kind of written testimony as well. Throughout this whole process, you should be putting conversations through the chair. So questions go through the chair rather than directly to the applicant. The applicant will answer questions directed toward the board and specifically to the chair. And this provides a great way for the chair to maintain order over the meeting and make sure that the rules are being followed and that you don't have some side conversation that takes place and some kind of cross-examination between a member of the public and the applicant, which is really what you don't want to have happen, that kind of direct conversation, because it can make things or allow things to get out of hand pretty quickly. And you are allowed to set time limits. And then you deliberate. You weigh the evidence. You use reasonable discretion in weighing that evidence. You base your judgments in relevant laws and regulations and ordinances, not just in your opinion or even in the master plan as we've seen, because this is not really a regulatory document. So if it's in the master plan, but you haven't translated that into your zoning ordinance or other regulations, then that's not really binding on your applicant. Your personal knowledge can be considered, but not in the face of uncontradicted expert testimony. Expert testimony can be contested with other valid, reliable evidence as determined by the board, not just upon opinion of yourself, other board members, or members of the public. There has to be some kind of reasonable, factual way of contradicting the other testimony. When you're finished weighing all this evidence and hearing all of the evidence and deliberating over it, then you can start making findings of fact, determining what pieces of evidence are really going to be valuable to the eventual decision that you make. And so you make findings of fact. They might be about, setbacks being followed and basic dimensional requirements. They may be about adherence to other parts of your regulations, and so on and so forth. All the facts that are determining what your decision is. So you make those findings of fact. Regardless of whether you anticipate to approve, conditionally approve, disapprove an application, you should be making these findings of fact. And they can be lighter or more thorough, depending on the application you're looking at. And certainly if you see an application might be contested or controversial, try to make your findings of fact as thorough as possible. And then finally, you get to make a decision. So again, you should be doing this usually within 65 days with some caveats there that we've talked about. The decision is made by a majority vote of the members that are present. A tie is not a decision. That is not a successful vote. If you have a vote to approve an application and that vote fails, that does not mean that the application has been denied or disapproved. That would be a separate vote. It just means the vote to approve has failed. And you can go back to your board and have a motion and a second for another vote. And whatever decision you make should be supported by relevant findings of fact. So basically you have three options in making your decision. You can approve or conditionally approve, related to that approval, approve with conditions, or you can disapprove. Um, if you are making an approval, um, are making an approval. Sorry, I just remembered something I was meaning to say earlier. I'll leave that aside for now. So when you're making your approval, um, you can make an approval without any conditions, but it's a good chance that there might be conditions. So the conditions might have to do with meeting various state and other permitting requirements. So if somebody has not, if an applicant has not completed the permitting process, that is not a valid reason to deny an app or disapprove an application. It is not a valid reason to not accept an application as complete even. Um, but rather, if they do need various permitting that is not yet complete, that can be a condition of approval, that those um, so I'm sorry, I'm tripping up here for a second, that those permits are completed prior to the final approval taking place when those conditions are met. Other things can also be put into a condition in terms of having fees um, for overview of the construction process and so on and so forth. If anything is said and if the applicant represents that they will do something during the course of a public hearing that's not in their application, but in the course of the hearing, it seemed like the prudent thing for them to do to make a promise to do something. That is not binding unless you put that into a condition of approval to make sure that goes into your conditions of approval as well. And for all these conditions of approval, you have conditions precedent. These are conditions that need to be met before the final approval takes place. And then you have conditions subsequent, and these are ongoing conditions after approval, and even after, in many cases, the build out. They could be, opening hours of the business can be sometimes are put in there, and other ongoing conditions that maybe the applicant has agreed upon during the public hearing process that you want to make sure are those conditions that are going forward with this site plan. Sometimes conditions precedent are merely administrative, like, hey, the various permitting has been completed, it gets submitted to the land use staff, and they check it off and say, okay, your approval is now complete, and you've completed your conditions, you're set to go. But sometimes to meet certain conditions might require value judgment of some sort, that the board has to make a real judgment and it's not just procedural. In those kind of cases, you might want to actually have a compliance hearing where the applicant comes back before the board at a hearing and presents its case that it has in fact met its conditions, and that the board can weigh back in and deliberate over whether those conditions in fact have been met. And then there's also the option of disapproval, which needs to be justified in the findings of fact why an application has been disapproved. And we heard a little bit in our previous session about how an applicant may or may not resubmit an application. And usually they may not resubmit the same application, with a few exceptions. And they may submit an materially, significantly altered application to meet the requirements or its deficiencies as seen by the board in its findings of fact. And when that decision has been made within 5 business days, a notice of decision should be completed, signed, and sent. um, including the findings of fact. Um, let's see. Vesting of development rights. We heard a little bit about this already from Christine, so I won't go too deeply into this. I say, active and substantial development within 3 years um, vests you from regulatory zoning changes for 7 years. The board may extend that 3 years sometimes. Um, and it's best if the board defines what it means by substantial completion of improvements and especially active and substantial development in its regulations. If it does not define these, you automatically, as an applicant, have 7 years without having to prove your active and substantial development of your application. And you can see more about that in RSA 674-39. And there are alternative review procedures, and you can look them up in the RSAs here for both site plan review and subdivision review, for example, of a technical review board. And these are for boundary line adjustments, minor site plans, where the town may decide that these do not need a full board hearing for the process and can go through a technical review committee instead. The public does not have to be invited to the meetings of this committee, although the proceedings should be, documentation of those proceedings should be recorded and be made available to the public for inspection. And I went through that a little bit quickly at the end because I see we're getting close to 11:45 here. We have about 6 minutes or so left. And I wanted to leave a little bit of time for questions. So perhaps if some of the things I glanced over at the end are still unclear, we can get to those. And I do see there's a lot of questions in the chat that maybe Brendan has been keeping track of.
Yes. Thank you,
And
John.
thank you all.
Yes, I've been I've been keeping track of the questions in the chat. I think you may have answered a few of them. Let's see, I saw a couple others coming in kind of close to the end. But let's see, maybe I'll start from the top and yeah, and again, if you're we can pass on a question, pass it off to the end session if necessary. But let's see, the one at the very top, the first question that we got was if a town does not have a planning board, can the town or does the town have any zoning ordinances? Is the question.
I do not believe that's the case because you need a planning board to approve the master plan, which then allows you the ability to create a zoning ordinance.
All right. And so I think you ended up kind of going over this, I believe. This question was asked when you were back on slide 78, but is there a rule of thumb for submission of materials before the meeting to allow for proper review, which I believe you kind of went over about maybe 5 slides ago or so in more detail, kind of the
So it's
process, the timing.
and this is the applicant submitting the materials.
Yes, I would. Yeah,
Yeah, so
yeah.
the town can determine its own um, time frame for submitting materials, so the board and the staff can review them. It can't be more than 21 days, but they can shorten that a little bit if they see fit. But typically, you don't want to shorten it too much because then the town doesn't have adequate time, and then once town staff, if you do have town staff, see it and compile everything. They have to send it to the board before the meeting, so the board has adequate time to review those as well, and are not trying to read it like the night before the planning board meeting when they might not have time.
Mhm.
So there's a reason these timelines exist, and they shouldn't be burdensome and overly long, which is why you can't go too long by statute. But they should be long enough to actually get a fair, informed review.
Mm, great. And the next question is kind of pertaining to how the planning board and the zoning board interact. And it's just, can you elaborate on how the planning board then interacts with the zoning board, clarifying who has decision authority on items and processes? This was asked back when you were on slide 45 about the zoning ordinances. But yeah, and just the interplay between the two
Yeah.
boards.
So I'll first of all say it's not a bad idea for the zoning board and the planning board to meet on a regular basis, not like, every month certainly, but like once a year, once every couple of years, just to touch base on seeing what's working and what's not working and getting some feedback from one another, on how you relate to one another. But more specifically, if something looks like it's going to need a special exception or certainly a variance, um, if you have town planning staff, they can start to kind of key the applicant into the fact that they might need to go to the zoning board in addition to the planning board. But if something makes it to the planning board, um, either because you don't have staff or because it kind of slipped through or it looks different than the staff saw it, even maybe, um, the planning board can identify something that's in violation of zoning that would need um, a variance. And at that point, there's a lot of discretion. If you started the public hearing already, you might end up putting it as a condition of approval to get that variance or even a special exception. Um, Oftentimes, we like to see things go for the zoning board before they come to the planning board if they do need a variance, because it is such a big hurdle to get to even know if you want to go through the whole process of going through the planning board. Um, but it doesn't have to work that way.
Hmm. All right. Um, so the next question, which again I think you did a pretty good job of answering, but maybe give a few examples. But somebody asked, can you provide examples of what might constitute a development of regional impact? Would that be and they were asking, is it a deviation from the master plan or an abutter dispute? So maybe a couple examples
Um,
of types of.
I mean, I think a deviation from the master plan, not necessarily. Um, at least that wouldn't be the determining factor. And a butter dispute, not necessarily, unless the butter is perhaps in a neighboring town. But if you're on the borderline of another town, certainly if it's something of size on the borderline of another town, that could be a regional impact. If it's a really large subdivision, that's going to add a lot of traffic. That's going to affect not only your local roads, but roads of nearby communities. That could be a regional impact. If something is going to affect the school system that you might be sharing with neighboring communities, that could be a regional impact. Um, and yeah, so there's a little bit of leeway for judgment. The RSA does give a lot of potential examples, but you don't have to hone completely into those potential examples. If something has a reasonable expectation of impacting not just your own community, but another community in a substantial way, it doesn't have to be a tiny way. But generally speaking, you are um, it's suggested that if you have any question if it is or it isn't, you should declare it a regional impact and go with that and let that process proceed by contacting your RPC and the abutting town. So if you are on the fence about it, go with a yes.
All right. Let's see. So we did have a couple questions come in. I know we're right at time, um, but this was sort of one of the last questions that just came in. But maybe it would be helpful to provide if you have any examples that distinguish a waiver from a variance. Like what examples of maybe a waiver might be and what would constitute variance if there's any, I don't know, relatively quickly because
Well,
we are right at time.
well, not to give specific examples, which can often be a kind of it depends sort of moment, but the basic difference is a variance is a um, where you're moving outside of the zoning ordinance, and is legally binding document that the town has adopted through its legislative body, whereas a waiver is an exception you're making to your regulations, your subdivision and site plan regulations that you've adopted as a board, which don't have that same regulatory and legal weight as the zoning ordinance. And so you have a little bit more leeway as a board to grant a waiver from your own internally adopted regulations than you do as a board to give someone a variance from the far more binding zoning ordinance, which then has to go to the ZBA.
Mhm. Excellent. All right. Well, thank you once again, John. We're yeah, right at the end of our session time here. I'm going to take control of the slides, and we are moving into our lunch break. So yes, thank you all for spending all this time with us. We're going to take a lunch break, and we're going to start back up at 12:45, so in a slightly less than an hour. But yeah, thank you,
All right.
John, for
And thank you, Brendan, and thank you all for joining.
excellent. All right, and we'll be picking back up with myself and Director Heather Shank. We'll be going over the planning board housekeeping in about an hour. And so, yeah, stay online. And but I'm gonna mute myself and the camera, and I'll be back in an hour. All right, see y'all then.